so good. It was so good. To Cuba. Just got back last night about 11:15, coming home from another delay. But no, it was from as an economist, as a political scientist, um, as you know, someone who's really interested in something kind of that you can get your hands around. How does this country evolve into where it doesn't have to rely so much on subsidies from others? I mean, they had the Russians,
Right.
and then they had Venezuela. Now they're having to kind of do it more on their own, and so there's a lot of
We're going to be helping them.
well, I doubt it. I doubt it. And but now tourism was like one of the high income people. Now services have gone up. They are exporting doctors to Brazil, and they're being paid $5,000 per doctor per month, and then they pay the doctor 1,000, and then they've gotten them up to 2,000 a month. Okay, uh, and so they are so doctors are doing in that way. They're training people to do a lot of very good restoration work in terms of restoring old buildings, which again is something that is exportable. I mean, so the export of services, they don't have a strong IT. Um,
Right.
they have training, but they don't have a strong
Structure that
structure,
isn't there.
right? And so, but they're training people, so those folks are, have the potential of being kind of the Indian equivalent, but closer. And I don't know. So that part was I just found that very very interesting to kind of think through how they're doing, and they're shifting their
All right. Where?
investment requirements
Oh, yeah, you're right.
because
Uh, can we can we start? Janine, I'm sorry. My fault.
that wasn't quite enough for some answers, and so they're now looking at resources components.
All right. Let's get back. Sorry for the delay.
Anyway, it's fascinating.
I've had a good time.
Hmm? I know, there you go. Isn't that nice? I believe we're ready for item number 5.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. My name's Eric Oppenheimer, Director of the Office of Research Planning and Performance. And with me today is David Rose, Staff Counsel, Office of Chief Counsel. And this is an informational item on the Emergency Water Conservation Regulation. In part, it will be a follow-up to the December 17th workshop that you held in Los Angeles, and essentially a summary of the input that we received leading up to that workshop and the input that we've got subsequent to the workshop, as well as a discussion of next steps, and it will be an opportunity for additional public input. So a little bit of brief background on how we got to where we are today. It was about a year ago or 13 months ago that the governor declared the drought. And that was really the first time that we saw the governor's call for 20% conservation by Californians. In April of 2014, the governor signed the second executive order pertaining to the drought, calling for Californians to redouble efforts on conservation as well as other areas of water savings. And that was where the governor directed the State Water Board to essentially evaluate the actions that urban water suppliers were taking in terms of water conservation and determine if those actions were sufficient to prevent wasteful uses of water. So in May 2014, we did a voluntary survey. I think we had about 200 water suppliers respond to that survey, where we basically asked them, what are you doing in terms of water conservation actions? What are you doing for mandatory restrictions? What are you doing for voluntary restrictions? And the result of that survey was that about half of the water suppliers in the state were still on voluntary restrictions. And armed with that information, the board determined that it would be appropriate to adopt emergency regulations compelling further action on water conservation as authorized under the April 2014 executive order. So that was mid-July 2014, and then the regulations were subsequently approved by Office of Administrative Law. Since that time, we've been doing monthly reporting to the board on conservation and the results of conservation efforts statewide. We also had, as I mentioned, a workshop December 17th in Los Angeles, and then the regulations have a life of 270 days, so if no further action is taken by the board, they would expire April 24th, 2015. Summarizing what's in the emergency regulation, just very briefly, there's, in my opinion, three main components. Prohibited water uses that apply to all Californians, and we're all well aware of what those are. Don't use potable water to wash driveways and sidewalks. Don't over-irrigate your landscaping. No use of fountains that don't have recirculating pumps. Don't wash your car unless the hose you're using has an automatic shutoff. Pretty basic things that kind of make sense for water conservation, and they apply again to all Californians. Then there's a set of directives or requirements for water suppliers. So the large water suppliers were directed to implement their water shortage contingency plans at the first stage that requires a mandatory restriction on outdoor water use. And similarly, the smaller suppliers, those with less than 3,000 service connections or deliver less than 3,000 acre feet a year, or those that don't have water shortage contingency plans, were directed to implement either 2 days a week watering restriction or to take comparable actions that would save a commensurate level of water as 2 days a week. Along with the new regulations came new enforcement tools for water suppliers and public agencies, where they could issue infractions for individuals that were violating one of the prohibited water uses. And then lastly, there was a requirement for monthly reporting for the large water suppliers. You saw this slide a couple weeks ago at our informational item in early February. It's just a good reminder of the essentially billions of gallons per month that have been saved statewide on water, as a result of water conservation, comparing this year to last year. When you add it all up, it's over 400,000 acre feet. It's a lot of water. We like to think it's partly a result of the board's action, as well as the action of all water suppliers statewide, and just the everyday actions that all Californians are taking, around their homes and in their homes to conserve water. So,
and this would be the moment to say,
SaveOurWater.com. Correct.
The first moment to say.
There'll be many of those moments. So we received a lot of really good comments and input and ideas on next steps that the board could take. And as a way to organize them, we essentially divided them up into three categories. One would be a set of short-term actions, and this really would essentially be modifications to the existing emergency regulation if the board were to re-adopt it. And then there's longer-term actions that we thought were potential ideas for further action the board could take long-term outside the scope of the emergency regulation. And then what we grouped as other potential long-term actions, and I'll go into more detail. I just want to make the point here that it was staff's determination sort of where each idea fit in one of these three bins, and it may not reflect what the commenter had in mind. I mean, we might have looked at something and said, this is really more appropriate for a longer-term action. The commenter might, disagree with that and feel that, this is something we should be doing immediately and should be in the content of any emergency regulation or renewal of an emergency regulation. So just to make that point. So there's the potential modifications to the emergency regulations, and they're grouped around the three aspects of the emergency regulation: the prohibited water use or the use restrictions, the directives to water suppliers, and then monitoring. I'm not sure if it's that order, but we grouped them that way. So for prohibited use restrictions, we heard essentially a lot about expanding to the current 4 that we have, adding a requirement that would require the use of recycled water where available for irrigation, construction, soil compaction, and dust control, and other uses.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Sure.
Would we, I know I've talked with folks who want to be using this and feel that our permitting system for doing it is a little bit slow. The general permit we did cover all of this if it meets Title 22? Is that the deal, or would we require, in order to make this a requirement, would we have to also do more of a general permit to make it easier to do?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question.
But the person behind you might be the best person to answer. He thought he was getting the day off, but no.
Yeah, I was hoping.
Yeah.
I believe that all of those requirements are in the general permit, all those uses.
And the only thing I would augment is the way that the general permit works is that the POTW that would enroll under the general order would need to make sure that its plan for use, and I'm looking to John to see if he recalls the details better, that covered these specific uses and was broad enough in scope to cover, for example, a construction facility or a construction project within its distribution area that was interested in hauling recycled water for these purposes.
Right, so is it the POTW then? I know the POTW is the point where we're going to monitor the quality of the recycled water, but can't the user apply for the permit? Or is it applied for by the POTW? I may just not be remembering.
My recollection is that either could apply, but it is almost universally the supplier of the recycled water.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
So we also heard there was a lot of overlap in the comments on the second bullet, the food service hospitality sector restriction. So this is the restriction where, it would require restaurants or anywhere where they serve food to only serve water upon request. And then in hotels and motels, the towel restrictions and the linen washing restrictions where, they would offer the option that towels only be or not be rewashed every day. So there was a lot of support for that one, and to add that one. Prohibit operation of all ornamental fountains. So this would essentially take away the recycling or the recirculating systems and basically say no more ornamental fountains or water features whatsoever. And then different iterations of prohibit overhead irrigation of any kind, either during, the winter, the dead of winter, or during rain events. So there'd be essentially, a prohibition on using outdoor irrigation anytime you've got more than a trace of rain or some kind of, threshold such
Hard
as that.
to say winter when it was 80 degrees.
True. And then for, again, modifications to the emergency regs, but directives to water suppliers, easy to understand information within bills. So right now, some people when they get their bill, they get a nice summary of their water use and how many gallons, and it's easy to sort of figure out what you're using. Other people, such as myself, it comes in 100 cubic feet, and it's a little bit difficult to, for the regular person to understand what does that mean and how much water am I using and is it going up or down. So, we could potentially add a requirement that either require them to include it in bills or post it on their website, something like that. I should also point out that, again, everything I'm talking about today is potential modifications. These are a summary of comments, and they don't reflect, our recommendation per se, but we wanted to sort of summarize at a high level what we heard. Require water audits or third-party evaluations for suppliers that, don't meet certain efficiency goals. Require notification of leaks. So if a water supplier was aware that a customer had a leak, there could be a requirement, say within 48 hours, that they notify that customer that there was a suspected leak. Limits on outdoor watering schedules based on local conditions. Minimum requirements on what constitutes a mandatory outdoor restriction on water use. This is something we've talked about quite a bit. Right now there's a lot of variation in terms of what is being implemented for water suppliers restriction on outdoor water use. In some cases, like I've said before, it's days of week or minutes per station. In other cases, it's just limits on time of day. And there was a lot of comments along the lines of we need to figure out a way to keep the flexibility there to allow suppliers to implement what they've planned for, but also be able to set some kind of minimum threshold or floor where it's clear what the minimum practice should be statewide. And then lastly, limit irrigation to 1 day a week with runtime caps during the winter. So basically a more restrictive version of that last bullet that I described.
Did anybody, and maybe this is later on, I looked at it, but I just don't remember. Did anybody make recommendations, and this would have to be long-term, about multifamily metering?
Yeah,
Because people in multifamily buildings don't know what their water use is.
there was a recommendation certainly for, I don't remember who provided it, but it was for sub-metering. And exactly what you're getting at, so that, you know, either billing could be done at the individual unit level within a multi-unit residential building, or just notification so you know how much water you're using when you live in an apartment building in a city. That was something that we put into the bin of long-term non-water board. Not that we wouldn't be involved or support it or, you know, want to help make it happen, but to me that seemed like a legislative change. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's just, you know how when you're out speaking, there are themes that come up in different times, and that's probably been the single most asked question I've gotten when I've gone out to talk about it.
That's also something to discuss with the CEC, because they do set the standards for buildings. And
And water conservation is energy
Absolutely.
conservation. Good point. Get that on the list.
Going too far here. Just additional, again, directives to water suppliers. So require enforcement of prohibitions at the local level. So this gets at somehow we would require the water suppliers to go out and enforce the prohibitions of prohibited water uses that we discussed earlier. Develop and implement a local enforcement strategy to achieve the replacement inefficient plumbing fixtures required by state law. So the concept here was we would require local water suppliers to be responsible for ensuring that individuals and businesses were in compliance with the current plumbing requirements at, you know, either the time that they established a bill or that at the time when the bill changed names, like there was a new tenant or new ownership of a property. So it would essentially put it in the hands of the responsibility with the water suppliers. Rather now, my understanding is done through ordinance, and sometimes it's time of like involved with real estate transfers and that type of thing. And then the next bullet, develop a local enforcement strategy. The idea here, it's different from what I just talked about. Essentially, we would just ask the suppliers to prepare a strategy detailing how they planned on dealing with enforcement and compliance issues within their service area. And it's not that they would submit it to us. Perhaps the requirement would be that they post it online, and it would be along the lines of, you know, this is going to be our approach when we receive a complaint. This is how we're going to handle it. And then additionally, they could report on like the number of complaints, the number of site visits, the number of notifications they've sent out, the number of enforcement actions they've taken. And right now in the current reporting, they can optionally report that type of information. And there's a handful of suppliers that are reporting at that level of detail, and it might be valuable to have, you know, that out there in a transparent way at each supplier. It would
That's
help.
because people want to know. That's the other thing people ask about all the time when they're talking about their own local agency.
Right, exactly.
That's interesting.
And then a number of water suppliers actually had a request that we require validation that commercial car wash recycling systems are properly functioning. And then lastly, require certification and training for water conservation staff as a requirement.
Interesting.
Reporting requirements. There was a lot of comments on additional information that we could collect as a result or as part of the regulation. I won't go through all of them. There's a long list. Some of the ones that stood out to me. Specific information on conservation measures that are being implemented by suppliers. So what are they doing? This might help answer the question of what's working and what's not. information on water use by sector. Right now we are collecting it. We're segregating out residential from all other uses, but there were people that thought it'd be helpful to have information on commercial and municipal uses. And then water use by source. So is it coming from the delta? Is it local? Is it groundwater? Is it surface water? Is it recycled water? Is it storm water? Information on leaks, information on greenhouse gas emissions. So there's just a wide information. There was a few requests to have information on rates, what's going on in terms of rates, rate design, penalties, drought surcharges, the use of reserve funds, information that gets sort of at how the drought and water conservation is affecting the financial capacity and the financial reserves of local suppliers. So there was a lot of information. Couple comments here or observations. I think, the information that we've collected so far has been really useful. And it's, my feeling is part of the reason we've been successful with this is because we've kept it simple. So I'm kind of torn here personally in terms of I love getting more information, and I'm a data person, so I would love to get a lot of additional information, but I balance that with the idea of keeping it simple. I think has helped us be successful. We've received a lot of positive input from the water suppliers on the fact that it has been pretty easy for them to do. Not all, some of them have been complaining, but for the most part, a lot of good feedback that it's been simple. We've been able to use it, even the information that we're currently collecting. We spend a lot of time post-processing it to report to you every month, which I think is very useful. I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but it's time-consuming. So I get a little bit concerned with placing additional burden on the water suppliers, as well as placing additional burden and expectation on ourselves as an agency that we're going to process all this additional information and use it. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
On the data issue, I don't know if this is the place to suggest this, but we collect information. The Division of Drinking Water collects information. The Urban Water Management Plans every 5 years have information. California Urban Water Conservation Council has information that they collect every 2 years. Lots of information. Some of it's kind of like not the same, but overlapping. Sometimes it's similar. Sometimes it's quite different. I strongly recommend that there be a meeting of staff from these various agencies that collect this basic data, and that you sort through what everyone's collecting and how might it be more the same, even to the point of like using the same amounts. If you're going to use cubic feet, we'll use cubic feet by everybody. If you're going to use some acre feet, use acre feet, but not have so many disparate pieces out there and make it more coherent. So that's my recommendation.
I think that's a great recommendation, and it's something we definitely should and need to do. There's a lot of opportunity to
before
put
we
the
do
pieces
stuff
together.
like more
Right.
on reporting.
So small font here, and I won't go through all this either, but potential long-term board action. So these are the things that seem longer term than putting them into a emergency regulation, but they seem like things that sort of were in the water board's potentially within our authority, and within the actions that the water board, for lack of a better word, could be the lead on. So there was a lot of comments on adopting use targets or goals in a whole bunch of ways, but whether it was statewide per capita use goal or indoor residential use goal. We actually got comments to the opposite saying we shouldn't be setting indoor use goals. So that they were, there were a lot of comments suggesting that we should be setting some kind of use goals or targets, and then some saying it would be counterproductive to do so. And then there was a number of comments in the area of we should define what are wasteful and unreasonable uses of water, and somehow limit those types of uses, and they're bulleted there. I won't go through them.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily long-term. I mean, that's an option for doing certain things faster, maybe not these things, but we do have that authority that we could choose to use in a more targeted way than statewide regulation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Perhaps long-term is the wrong word here. I was trying to separate it from the actions within the emergency regulation. I think probably ongoing or long-term would be a better title. So that's a good point. Compel enforcement and implementation of the model landscape ordinances, require rain shutoff devices for irrigation to eliminate watering during when it rains, require hotels and motels only to use recycled water, or for outdoor irrigation where it's available, where it's possible and appropriate. And then the last two, by their nature, these aren't things that go into the emergency regulation. This is make the prohibited uses permanent and make the reporting requirements permanent. And then for other potential long-term actions, there was really there were really four categories that they fell into: education and outreach. And I didn't include all of the ideas that we had. There were over 30 suggested in these four broad categories. But a lot of people essentially said we should be providing funding for Save Our Water. We should be doing more with schools to get the word out. We should essentially be doing more advertising. These are things that, things that are important. I think the board should be involved with, but there are others, for example, SaveOurWater.com, who probably are in a better, position to be the lead on like education and outreach. Technical assistance, that's something that we definitely would want to partner with people like the Department of Water Resources and maybe the Urban Water Conservation Council, putting together, technical panels and workshops to showcase water savings technologies and trying to define things like poor performing areas, because it may not be as simple as we've, made it in our.
Right, that's, I think, really important.
Right. And then funding, there was a lot of different input on the use of funding or the conditioning of funding, such that statewide grants and loans would only be provided in cases where there was a determination that they were meeting certain conservation requirements. And then legislative type activities. We talked about the sub-metering. There was also a lot of input on the model landscape ordinance and basically modernizing that and updating that to make it better and more effective. So those are things that we felt were better placed under legislative changes rather than the board trying to do something independently on. And then lastly, just our recommendations to staff where we go from here. Given the continuing drought, given the water supply outlook, and given the vast majority of the comments that we received through this process, we definitely recommend extending the existing emergency regulation. As we showed on the chart, it seems to have been quite effective, and it seems like the drought is going to definitely continue. We think some fine-tuning needs to occur to address some of the things that we saw in the previous slides. So our recommendation would be to, let us work on that, figure out what makes the most sense, taking into consideration your input today, any additional comments we hear today, bring it back for the second March meeting. That would be March 17th, so that we could have you take action if that's the direction you want to go before the current emergency regulation expires, so we wouldn't have any kind of gap in regulatory coverage. And then for the long term, continue to look at the need, what would go in any long-term water board conservation action, and what authority we might use to make that happen. So first order of business, address the emergency regulation and extend it would be our recommendation, fine-tune and extend. At the same time, look at the long-term action. And that summarizes the staff.
Terrific, and I know we'll hear from a number of people, and whether it falls within fine-tune or whether there are pieces of what people have to say that we're interested in you pursuing earlier rather than later. I mean, there's something that says we can't do something simple on the 17th and then take steps as we progressively run through the rainy season without rain.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Any questions before we move to comments? I know we have a number of comment cards, so.
I have one. I like a lot of these ideas. I think that